Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kyle Fischer. He has just finished his PhD in Evolutionary Political Psychology at the University of Auckland, and today we're going to talk about the work he's done during his PhD. So, Kyle, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much. I really like your work, so thanks for having me.
Great. So, what is political ideology from an evolutionary perspective?
Well, ideology can be defined as interrelated beliefs and attitudes and values that kind of organize political views and translate into political behavior. But from an evolutionary perspective, to understand it from that perspective, it's helpful to focus on the kind of broader definition of politics. So politics is fundamentally the process of dealing with conflicts of interest that arise from living in groups. So kind of any species that lives in groups and has individuals with conflicting interests should have some form of politics. So chimpanzees, for example, as Frans de Waal has shown, have quite sophisticated political behaviors. So they compete for status in dominance hierarchies and display some quite Machiavellian tactics like forming coalitions to overthrow dominant males, and even some groupish behaviors like patrolling their territorial borders to protect their borders from other chimpanzee troops. So, yeah, they have some political behaviors, and then humans are, of course, also political animals, as Aristotle famously said. So we probably evolved our political natures from our chimpanzee ancestors, or our chimpanzee-like ancestors, or there would have been probably a mixture of chimpanzee and bonobo kind of ancestors. But unlike our ape ancestors, we have like greater cognitive abilities, and we live in larger groups, more complex groups, even consisting of strangers. So we have more complex politics. And we can also mentally organize our political motivations into what we call ideology. Obviously, chimpanzees can't do that. But we share motivations with chimpanzees, political motivations like, as I said, competing for status and forming coalitions. So that's kind of a broad answer to your question. But as you know, my colleagues and I have been working on a specific evolutionary theory of political ideology, and we can dive into that maybe later.
Yeah, we'll get into that specifically in a bit, but before that, just a couple more questions. Is political ideology unidimensional? Because many times people talk about it as a sort of left-wing versus right-wing thing or something like that, but is that really the case?
Yeah, yeah. So as you say, many people think of it as unidimensional, including scholars and lay people. So they think of it as progressives and liberals on the left and conservatives on the right. And I think this is probably because this is how political issues are packaged in the Western world. So no one knows exactly why, but this is how it is. So in the US, for example, you have the Democratic Party on the left and the Republican Party on the right. And kind of all the Democratic Party's views are left-wing, and all the Republican Party's views are right-wing. And people who are exposed to this political polarization tend to think of themselves as either left-wing or right-wing. And they even shift their views around to match their political tribes. So you might have some economic left-wing beliefs or right-wing beliefs, but people often shift them to fit in with their political party or their political side. But obviously this isn't always the case. Often people naturally just have all their views either left-wing or right-wing. But many people around the world, and even in the US, have some left-wing beliefs and some right-wing beliefs. So their views can't neatly be summarized by one dimension of ideology. They can't be classified as either left-wing or right-wing. So you can think of libertarians in the US. So they have left-wing social views. So they support cannabis legalization, for example, but they have right-wing economic views. So they support free market capitalism. So yeah, anyway, probably over the last 80 years, scholars have been finding that ideology can't be summarized by this one dimension. So they've used many different questionnaires and looked at moral values and policy preferences and everything. And they found that ideology is probably two-dimensional. They keep finding two dimensions of ideology. So these dimensions have many different labels. But yeah, basically the one dimension it's thought to be about economic issues. But I would say more fundamentally, it's about inequality and hierarchy versus equality. And then the other dimension is about socio-cultural issues, and more fundamentally about social control versus freedom. So yeah, there's more evidence for the two-dimensional view than the one-dimensional view. That's the short answer.
And how do these two dimensions manifest on the right and the left?
So on the right, you have your typical conservatives. So they support social control and hierarchy. So you can think of rich televangelists, for example. So they support economic competition and they promote being rich and the idea that men should be in charge. So that's their pro-hierarchy beliefs. But they also support social control. So they want the government to control how other people live their lives and what they do with their bodies in terms of sex and drugs, for example. And yeah, many conservative American presidents would also fall into this category. But then there's people on the right who support equality. They oppose equality and are kind of tolerant of hierarchy. So they're pro-competition. That makes them right-wing, but they're also pro-freedom. So they're against social control. An example would be libertarians like Milton Friedman or Ayn Rand. And then on the left, you have your typical left-wing progressives who are the opposite of the televangelists I was talking about. And they oppose traditional hierarchy and social control. So they're pro-freedom and pro-equality. So Nelson Mandela would be an example of such a person. Maybe an example of an intellectual who has such an ideology would be like Sam Harris, pro-equality and pro-freedom. And then also on the left, you have people who support equality, but also social control. So they're left-wing people who are against inequality, but pro-censorship, for example. So they can be called left-wing authoritarians. So yeah.
Yeah, and we will get into the authoritarians also later in the interview. Just before we get into your theory of the dual evolutionary foundations of political ideology, let me just ask you another thing. So there have been traditional ways of explaining individual differences in political ideology, like ideological asymmetry and ideological symmetry. Could you explain this?
Yeah, so as you say, the traditional ways of explaining individual differences in ideology, the dominant view, or the most well-known view, is the ideological asymmetry model. And it's based on the one-dimensional view of ideology. And it's basically the idea that the left and the right are fundamentally psychologically different. So the right is characterized, according to this view, as rigid like cognitively rigid, conformist, fearful, and so on. And that can be summarized as psychological needs for security and certainty. So people with these needs are thought to be attracted to conservatism in particular because conservatism offers safety and certainty, so it caters to their needs because it justifies the status quo and emphasizes group unity. It doesn't rock the boat and involve a lot of uncertainty like liberal ideology does. And this view also characterizes the right as particularly groupish and prejudiced. And this goes all the way back to the aftermath of World War II in the 50s, when scholars in the Frankfurt School were trying to explain the origins of fascism and Nazism and anti-Semitism. But around the same time, other scholars reacted to this and pointed to communism as kind of a rigid ideology that is kind of the left-wing equivalent of Nazism and fascism. So from this arose the ideological symmetry model. It's also called the rigidity of the extreme model. So it's the idea that the political left and right are basically psychologically the same. So they're equal in conformity and threat sensitivity and intergroup bias. And the idea is that fear drives people towards the extremes because the extremes offer like a simple black and white worldview and more certainty. But probably because of left-wing bias in academia, the ideological asymmetry model, the rigidity of the right model, in other words, has been studied more and has gained lots of evidence in its favor. But it's been criticized for conceptual and methodological reasons. And people recently trying to overcome these problems with previous studies have started to find evidence for the ideological symmetry model and the rigidity of the extreme model. But if you look at the evidence as a whole, basically it's mixed because both models have evidence in their favor. So the debate kind of continues to rage on. And I would say this is because both models aren't quite accurate, because they're both, partly because they're both based on the one-dimensional view of ideology.
Mm-hmm. So tell us then about your dual evolutionary foundations of political ideology and how it differs from these other traditional ways of thinking about political ideology.
So it's probably helpful to first tell you about the two dimensions of ideology. Okay. So kind of what they are. Mm-hmm. So as I said, the one dimension is basically support for hierarchy versus equality. And the other dimension is support for social control versus freedom. Mm-hmm. So for simplicity, let's just call them the hierarchy and the social control dimension. So for the hierarchy dimension, you can think of people on the one end as people who support unbridled economic competition, free market capitalism. They're not opposed to hierarchies. Interestingly, like they tend to be male and physically strong. But obviously this isn't always the case. Many women are also on the side of the dimension, like Ayn Rand. And then people on the other side of this dimension are pro-equality. So they support social welfare and social justice. So you can think of social justice activists and the Occupy Wall Street movement, for example. And then for the social control dimension, you have collectivism and authoritarianism on the one side versus individualism on the other side. Another example would be religious and social conservatism on the one side versus social liberalism on the other side. Because, on one side you have social control, the other side freedom. Religious conservatives, as I said, often want to control how other people live their lives, for example. And they're against abortion and same-sex marriage and recreational drug use, and they want strict laws and the death penalty. And then socially liberal people are the opposite of that. They're pro-freedom and individualistic, and this kind of manifests even in the home. So authoritarians and social conservatives are more strict on their kids. Anyway, yeah, so this two-dimensional view, I would say, better captures the political landscape than the one-dimensional view. And then my colleagues and I have been working on an evolutionary theory to explain why these two dimensions exist in the first place, like why they evolved. So basically, this theory is called the dual foundations theory of ideology. So it builds on work in evolutionary anthropology and primatology, and then marries it to work in political psychology that shows that there's two dimensions of ideology. And the theory is basically that ideology is underpinned by two key fitness trade-offs inherent to the evolution of human social life or group living. So specifically, the trade-off between cooperation and competition, we argue, underpins the hierarchy dimension. And then the trade-off between conformity and individualism underpins the trade-off underpins the social control dimension. Mm-hmm. So to put it simply, the dual evolutionary foundations of ideology are cooperation and conformity. But yeah, let me break that down a little bit because it's more complicated than that. So you've had Michael Tomasello on your show before.
Yeah.
So we kind of build on his work and some other evolutionary anthropologists and primatologists. So their work shows that, or suggests that, the evolution of human social life from great ape social life occurred in two main steps. So in one step, humans became more cooperative and shared the spoils of cooperation more equally than our ape ancestors did, or our pre-human ancestors did. And humans had to do this in the harsh ancestral environment because we lived in the African savanna and we had to hunt and gather and raise our very helpless offspring. So we had to cooperate to survive. And then in a second step, humans became very conformist. So we're an exceptionally conformist species. And we became more groupish and followed norms in large groups that were and are culturally distinctive. So separating the in-group from the out-group with cultural markers. And we had to do this to kind of coordinate our actions in large groups as groups became larger, even consisting of strangers. And this would have helped us to promote more group cohesion in large groups, which would have helped our groups to prevail in warfare, intertribal warfare. And conforming would also have helped us to socially learn complex knowledge that accumulated over thousands of years in our tribes. So like which berries to avoid and how to make complex hunting weapons, for example. So this would have all helped us to survive and reproduce. But then, obviously, not everyone is equally cooperative and conformist, so there's big individual differences. So, yeah, first of all, my colleagues and I argue that these two steps towards more cooperation and conformity are strikingly similar to the two domains of ideology. So, views on hierarchy and inequality involve cooperation and cooperative dilemmas that humans have always faced, like how to redistribute resources. So hunter-gatherers have to decide how to redistribute meat after a successful hunt, for example, and humans in modern nation states have to decide how to distribute wealth. And associated with this dimension of ideology is also environmentalism and climate change beliefs, which also involve cooperation and cooperative dilemmas, because you have to make sacrifices to protect the environment and fight climate change. And then views on social control, like social conservatism, involve conformity and enforcing group norms. So as modern examples, you can think of tight-knit religious groups and patriotic Americans who are very group-minded, and patriots are group-minded on the national level, so they see the nation as the in-group. So yeah, humans have always faced these kind of cooperative dilemmas, and they've always been groupish. And then, as I said, there's big individual differences in cooperation and conformity, which manifest, we argue, as differences in support for hierarchy and social control. And there's both genetic and environmental reasons for that. So we build on work by Daniel Nettle and others when it comes to the genetic side of things. He argues that heritable traits that come with costs and benefits, so frequency-dependent selection acts on those traits, which results in the evolution of individual differences in populations. So in humans and other animals, there'll be big differences between individuals in terms of traits that come with costs and benefits. So an example that's relevant here is kind of openness to new things. Even animals, some animals are more, or some individual animals are more open, whereas others are more fearful. And humans are the same. So there's big differences that evolved in openness because there's costs and benefits involved. So openness can benefit you and give you opportunities, but it's very risky and can get you killed. So the opposite strategy would be kind of conformity, which also has costs and benefits. So it's safer, but the costs are you can follow outdated information and maladaptive traditions, for example, or it can cause cultural stagnation if it's too extreme. So yeah, basically there's space for both strategies, openness and conformity, to evolve. And then this manifests as differences in the social control dimension of ideology in modern populations. And then there's also costs and benefits involved in cooperation. So the same argument can be applied to the hierarchy dimension. And then there's environmental reasons to expect differences between people in cooperation and conformity. So it would be maladaptive if individuals never change their behaviors based on environmental factors. So when it comes to cooperation, people should cooperate less and compete more in resource-scarce environments. So resource scarcity should affect cooperation, and then views on hierarchy. And people should conform more when there's more danger, because it's safer to conform. So yeah, those are some of the environmental reasons to expect differences. And then there's also social learning. So people copy the cooperative and conformist behaviors of others, or the opposite behaviors like individualism or competitiveness. Yeah, so basically to sum it all up, you can think of it like this. There's kind of two evolved dials in the human brain. One is called cooperation, the other is called conformity, and they're set at different levels in everyone by biological factors, but they can be turned up or down by environmental factors. And in modern human populations, when they're turned down, or when cooperation is turned down, it manifests as support for hierarchy. When cooperation is turned up, it manifests as support for equality. And when conformity is turned down, it manifests as support for freedom. And when it's turned up, it manifests as support for social control. So yeah, that's basically the dual evolutionary foundations of ideology. That's a long answer.
No, but that was great, and I have some follow-up questions. So, when you talked about openness, you were referring to openness to experience from the Big Five, correct?
Yeah, that's one way of measuring it. Yeah. But yeah, risk proneness is involved in that as well. So just openness and being less fearful.
And does this tie in any way to moral foundations theory or not?
Yeah. So there's five moral foundations: purity and authority and group loyalty, fairness and care. And care and fairness are associated with cooperation and empathy and compassion, and they've been shown to be related to the one dimension of ideology, the hierarchy dimension. So people who care more about fairness and harm are more in support of equality and yeah. And then the other three moral foundations are called the group binding moral foundations, and they have been shown to be related more to the social control dimension. So many studies have shown that they correlate with social conservatism and not economic conservatism, for example. Yeah.
So we've already touched a little bit on this, but then what would characterize left-wing authoritarianism and right-wing authoritarianism?
So as I said, there's the social control dimension of ideology. And I actually have a sketch here that I can show you. So these are the two dimensions.
Okay.
And then people who support social control, who have their kind of conformity dials turned up, they can also have their cooperation dials turned down and support hierarchy. So these people can be called right-wing authoritarians, also social conservatives, many different labels. But on the other hand, you have people who have their social control dials turned up, conformity dials turned up, but their cooperation dials turned down. So they support equality, but also social control, and they can be called left-wing authoritarians. So yeah, basically, right-wing authoritarianism sounds extreme, but it's basically just the name of a scale or a questionnaire that measures this right-wing support for social control is called the right-wing authoritarianism scale. And authoritarianism just means support for social control, which only sometimes manifests in extreme ways. So yeah, right-wing authoritarianism is very similar to social conservatism and religious conservatism, and they all kind of have been shown to be underpinned by fearfulness and rigidity, so they're all very, very similar and very highly correlated with each other. And then when it comes to left-wing authoritarianism, it's people who support equality and should be more cooperative according to the dual foundations theory, but also support social control. So they pro-censorship, for example. Yeah, and all of this is pretty important because many scholars actually argue that left-wing authoritarianism doesn't even exist, or they argue that it's kind of rare, at least, and not much work has been done on it. So, yeah, the fact that the theory or our theory predicts kind of what it would be like is pretty important because not much is known about it. And it also informs the ideological asymmetry debate because it suggests that there'll be a symmetry in terms of conformity with authoritarians on both sides who are conformist. But yeah, so recently more work has started to be done on left-wing authoritarianism. So Thomas Costello and his colleagues developed a scale to measure it. And yeah, it's a very promising scale. I've been using it in my studies. And yeah, my work combined with other work shows that left-wing authoritarianism is like a very real phenomenon. So yeah.
But I mean, traditionally people have been focusing much more on right-wing authoritarianism, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So there's another aspect of human psychology that people in political psychology usually refer to when trying to understand why people adopt a particular political ideology that is social dominance orientation. Is that also related to your model of the dual evolutionary foundations of political ideology?
Yeah, for sure. So as I said, the social control dimension can be measured in many different ways. One way is with the right-wing authoritarianism scale, and this is often used in conjunction with the social dominance orientation scale to measure the other dimension of ideology. So the hierarchy dimension can be measured with the social dominance orientation scale. And these two are usually used together to measure two-dimensional ideology. And social dominance orientation is basically just, it captures support for group-based hierarchy and inequality, so intergroup inequality. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's just another measure of hierarchy beliefs.
Yeah. And what are some of the main predictions you derived from your model of political ideology?
Yeah, so the model makes a lot of novel predictions, but I would say it has 4 or 5 main predictions. So the first prediction is that the hierarchy dimension should be underpinned by differences between people in cooperation and similar traits like empathy and compassion. So people who are more cooperative and compassionate should score lower on questionnaires like the social dominance orientation scale, because they should support equality more and social welfare. And importantly, by cooperation here, I mean general cooperation, universal cooperation, not in-group cooperation. So in-group cooperation should underpin the social control dimension of ideology, because that's the more groupish dimension, the conformist dimension. So authoritarians, for example, should cooperate only with their trusted in-group members. And then the social control dimension should also be underpinned by individual differences in conformity. And like the whole bundle of traits that go with that, like threat sensitivity, disgust sensitivity. So disgust is kind of like another kind of threat sensitivity, because disgusting things have deadly pathogens in them. So that's part of it. And then also cognitive rigidity, lower creativity, lower openness. All of these things should be related to the social control dimension. And as I said before, this can manifest on the left and the right. So authoritarians on both sides should have these traits. And then there's predictions about the environmental factors that I touched on before. So you should see more support for hierarchy when there's fewer resources to go around, because there should be more competition in such environments. And then similarly, for the social control dimension, when the environment is more dangerous, you should see more conformity because it's safer, and as a result, more support for social control. So those are like the main predictions of the model.
Mm-hmm. Have you tested them, and if so, what were the results?
Okay, so prepare yourself for another long answer, because I found lots of interesting things, so
okay.
Just bear with me. But before getting into my own studies, let me first maybe tell you what's already known, or what was already known before I started my research.
Okay.
So people are indeed less cooperative when resources are scarce. So in poorer neighborhoods, for example, people cooperate less in economic games. And support for hierarchy in the form of social dominance orientation is higher in poorer countries. So that prediction kind of has some evidence in its favor. And then conformity and support for social control are actually higher in dangerous environments, and they increase in response to threatening and disgusting stimuli. So even in experiments, when people are made to think of disgusting things or threatening things, they show more socially conservative beliefs afterwards. Then the final thing that was already known is that the hierarchy dimension is associated with differences in cooperation and empathy. So, for example, I wrote a review of what economic game experiments tell us about ideology. And yeah, well, for those who don't know, economic games are basically experiments where people are given a certain amount of money and then can decide how to allocate it. So they can keep it for themselves or they can give it to others in different scenarios. But yeah, so I found experiments that use these economic games show that, like general conservatism, just right-wing people in general, are less cooperative and more selfish in economic games. But importantly, studies that look at the two dimensions of ideology find that this is explained by the hierarchy dimension. So people who are higher in social dominance orientation and people who are economic conservatives, they're the ones who are less cooperative in economic games compared to people who support equality. And then my colleagues ran a high-powered study in New Zealand to also test this. And they used a whole suite of economic games, and they measured different kinds of support for hierarchy, including economic conservatism and everything. And they found the same thing. So across all of these games, people who support hierarchy and economic competition are more competitive and self-interested in these games. So they kind of argued that a cooperative phenotype underpins the hierarchy dimension. So that's all in line with the theory. And then I built on this by running my own studies. So I ran 3 studies to test other predictions. So in the first study, I ran experiments to look at how ideology relates to different kinds of cooperation in economic games in intergroup scenarios. So I looked at in-group cooperation and universal cooperation, for example. So I first assigned people to groups based on their taste in art. And so this is very abstract. It's the minimal group paradigm. And I looked at their attitudes and behaviors in subsequent economic games involving these groups. So like how they felt about, I first looked at how they felt about their groups and then how they behaved towards their groups, the in-group and the out-group. So this kind of gets at very basic or general groupishness, rather than prejudices or biases that are influenced by real-world intergroup relations. So like in the real world, everyone is prejudiced towards some groups. Everyone has their in-groups and their out-groups, but not everyone is equally group-minded at the fundamental level. So this experiment kind of gets at this kind of group-minded predisposition. And then to complement this, I also measured self-reported competitive motives. And looking at how all this relates to ideology, I first looked at general conservatism and found that conservatives display, as previous studies show, they display more selfish and competitive behaviors, but they also display more groupish behaviors. So this kind of didn't make sense because how can they be selfish and groupish? So this was explained by the two dimensions again. So I looked at the two dimensions of ideology and found that people higher in social dominance orientation are the ones who are more competitive and selfish. And they show lower empathy and higher interpersonal exploitativeness. And it's people on the right who support social control, the right-wing authoritarians who show more groupish preferences. So, for example, they even identify more with their abstract in-group, and they give more money to the abstract in-group. So they have a general group-oriented predisposition. And yeah, the result for social dominance orientation is interesting because the widespread view of of this construct is basically that it's fundamentally about between group competition. And I found, or my results suggest that it's more fundamentally egoistic or self-interested competitiveness, which can manifest as between group competition, because dominating an outgroup can gain the individual resources. But yeah, it's more fundamentally seems to be egoistic competitiveness. And then in the same study, I looked at left-wing authoritarianism with that scale that I mentioned before. And I found that people who score highly on the scale show some competitive and some groupish preferences. So it's kind of a mixed bag. And it's probably because the scale measures a whole host of extreme left-wing views, not only support for social control. So not only authoritarianism, but other left-wing views like wanting to violently overthrow hierarchies and things like that. Yes, that's the first of my studies. Mm-hmm. Then in the second study, I did 3 studies. So that was the first one. And then the second one, I looked at how left and right-wing authoritarianism relate to conformity and similar traits that I mentioned before, like disgust sensitivity and everything. And so I looked at self-reported norm enforcement and norm following, disgust sensitivity, and then also behavior in abstract tasks designed to measure in-group conformity and rule following and lower creativity. So for example, I used the same method as before, where I assigned people to groups based on their taste in art. And then I presented them with a task that I designed to test in-group conformity. So that's inspired by Solomon Asch's famous experiments. So participants are basically presented with sets of squiggly lines, in this case. And the lines are of different lengths. And the people must decide which line is the longest. And then they see what the rest of the group chose. And then they can change their minds. So those who kind of conform to the majority opinion are classified as in-group conformists in this experiment. Anyway, so I found that left and right-wing authoritarians display in-group conformity in this experiment, and the whole suite of other traits that I measured, like disgust sensitivity and lower creativity. They also followed rules in another abstract task. And then social dominance orientation was not consistently related to these traits and negatively predicted a few of them. So yeah, negatively correlated with some of them. So yeah, these findings in general support the dual foundations theory. They also inform the ideological asymmetry debate because they suggest that there's conformity and similar traits on both sides. Specifically among authoritarians on both sides. Yeah, so if you take my findings from these 2 studies together, there's some ideological asymmetries and some symmetries. And asymmetries in terms of cooperation, and that's explained by the hierarchy dimension, and then there's symmetries in terms of conformity and similar traits, and that's the social control dimension. And then in my final study, I looked at what the dual foundations theory tells us about the COVID pandemic or responses to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So the popular view is that kind of all kinds of conservatives are anti-lockdowns and all liberals or progressives are pro-lockdowns and concerned about COVID. And a few studies have shown this to be the case. But they didn't look at the 2 dimensions of ideology. So the dual foundations theory predicts that conservatives who support competition and hierarchy will tend to be anti-lockdowns for kind of egoistic reasons. So Trump is maybe a good example of a conservative that is this kind of conservative. And meanwhile, social and religious conservatives should be more threat sensitive and averse to pathogens, and so they should be pro-lockdowns and concerned about COVID. and they want to protect themselves and their group from this threat. And then the theory also predicts, with the environmental factors I mentioned before, so COVID is a threat, so it predicts that support for social control in particular will go up after the COVID pandemic hit. So I ran a study in the UK to investigate all of this and found that, conservatives who support hierarchy are indeed anti-lockdowns, and they showed less empathic and cooperative attitudes about COVID. So, for example, they didn't care as much about people who were vulnerable to getting sick. And they were anti-lockdowns. And then right-wing authoritarians, meanwhile, were more worried and displayed more conformist pro-lockdown responses to the pandemic. So you can kind of look at it another way to look at left-wing people. So egalitarian progressives, who are low in social dominance orientation, were pro-lockdowns for empathic reasons, whereas individualistic progressives who are low in right-wing authoritarianism were anti-lockdowns because they're less fearful and they value freedom. So in line with the theory, basically there's people on both sides who are for and anti-lockdowns for different reasons. And then my final finding was that support for social control in the form of right-wing authoritarianism increased after COVID-19 hit. So I measured right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation before COVID-19 hit and after COVID-19 hit among the same people. And their right-wing authoritarianism scores increased after COVID-19 hit. So those are my main findings.
Yeah, great. Do you think that these two evolutionary foundations of political ideology would be enough to understand all aspects of variation of political ideology across individuals and collectives, or would you expect that there would be other foundations out there?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally support for hierarchy versus equality and support for social control versus freedom captures all political types, and even on the collective level and the individual level. But not all of the scales used to measure these dimensions are perfect, and they might not capture all kinds of people, but fundamentally everyone should be captured by those two dimensions, because everyone should support hierarchy and social control to varying degrees. So it captures people like libertarians and what can be called the silent majority, which the one-dimensional view often misses.
Mm-hmm. So would you like to tell us what is the future of your academic career? Will you continue doing work on this model of political ideology or something else?
Yeah, so I'll definitely carry on for a while studying this. It's very interesting. And I have a few studies in the pipeline looking at how left-wing authoritarianism relates to different things. For example, and there's also biological things to look at, so like neurobiological foundations of the two dimensions that I'm interested in. But I have broad interests, so even might study animal cognition and evolutionary psychology in general in the future. But I'm focused on this for now.
So before we go, where can people find you and your work on the internet?
So my Twitter handle is Arkyfish, ARKYFISH. And I have a Google Scholar profile, and all my work that's published so far is on there.
Okay, great. So, Kyle, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for doing the very interesting work you're doing.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the interview. I enjoyed it.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to help me keep the channel sustainable, please visit my Patreon page or PayPal and consider making a pledge there. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. The show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Parago Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alec, Jonathan Wissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrique Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windaga, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Cabana, Mark Blythe, Roberto Iguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Dugny, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslin Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litska, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, and Todd Shackelford. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffini, Kian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.